Hello and welcome to the last module of the course, Module 10. In this module, we're going to look at how you can create a windowed application. For many people, they find the console application is kind of intimidating. And so this is kind of a nice feature to include on a application that you're making if you have the time. As we'll see, it can be a little tricky, especially to make it look nice, but I'll give you the basics so you know what you're getting into. Now I find these kind of fun, but once again, I will warn you they're kind of tricky, so just try to enjoy it. Don't worry about making everything look perfect. In addition to that, in this module there's some videos that you're going to do in the assignment that's going to talk about some of the differences between languages. For example, you're going to see in the video a reference to working with C# instead of Python and contrast the two, and how to work with the Microsoft's Visual Studio environment, which is now available on both Mac and Windows. So I think you'll have some fun with that. But for this video, we're going to focus on creating the windowed user interface, and we need to get started with that, so let's do it. First thing to note is that there's actually a bunch of modules that you can download, purchase, and use to create a windowed interface. But there is a simple one that comes with Python. It's the TK interface, or tkinter as you may see it abbreviated. This is a standard module that works on Linux, Windows, Mac OS, and although it's not the prettiest thing to work with, it certainly will get the job done, especially if you're just trying to make something simple for the team that they can use to set up some kind of automation, such as interacting with network share, or creating folders and files and filling them up with test data and various other common tasks that you might perform. So the way it works is you import the module and then you start using the classes and methods that are inside that module, just like you would have learned in Module 9. And you'll create an interface, something that might look like this. So you can see in this particular example, I've got a windowed interface on Windows, Microsoft Windows. If I were to do this on a Mac, it would look similar but a little bit different, such as the buttons would be on the left instead of the right, and a few other things. But the good news is you can write the code once and then use it on multiple operating systems with a lot of changes in the code, just it'll change cosmetically. You can see here that this interface has things like tabs, which allow me to use a small amount of real estate, this little rectangle here, to have lots of different widgets or controls, such as buttons and text boxes and labels and other things to interact with my program. And just like you've expected, since you've been working with computers, I should be able to click on a button and perform some kind of action. So I suspect that if I click on this, it would select data, product data, somehow from a file or maybe a database, and then show me that result probably in here. Now this in this TK interface, this is a multi-line text box. These multi-line text boxes are a great place to put data that you want to display. And the reason for that is you can actually highlight that data, copy and paste it into something else like Excel or some other tool later on. So this is kind of a good way to do it, and we'll see how that's done. Of course, if they want to insert product data, they would type it into these text box, hit the insert button, and they would have a brand new product object in memory. If they want to change that object, I'd have to put in something like the ID to identify which object I'm trying to change, and the new name. If there are other fields or attributes to that object, of course, I'd have other text boxes and labels. And if I want to delete product information, imagine there must be a list of product objects that we would delete items from. So looking at this interface, I can actually glean quite a bit of information about how this application works just by looking at it. it looks to me like there's some product objects that we're going to manage, and it looks like we're going to be doing some inventories. I imagine if I do an inventory, I probably have to put my name and the date that the inventory happens, and then inventory counts would probably be a list of products, and you have to put in the number of items that you counted. That would be my guess, just looking at this windowed interface, and that is one of the handy things about these, is that you can actually make some pretty decent educated guesses without having to do a lot of looking through code or documentation, unlike a console application, which may be a little less intuitive for many people anyway. Now, to create one of these, you first have to have a root object, a window root object. So the way it works is you have a root object. This is the root of your user interface, and then you put buttons and text boxes inside of that object. So it forms a hierarchy. The root is at the top of the hierarchy. The button and text box will be under that. I could put things, depending on some kind of controls, like the tabs. A tab would be under the root, and then the buttons and text boxes and labels are under the tab. Now, we're not going to do anything that fancy in this class, this course, but it's kind of fun to play with, and certainly I'll give you links where you can go learn how to do that. To start off, I need to import the TK module. So I would go through and import this TK interface, Tkinter. Yeah, I don't care about the spelling, thank you very much. And then optionally, you can give it an alias. Now, I see this all the time. You don't have to, it's optional, but I will say this. If you do give an alias, as you know, or maybe you don't, but I'll remind you, if you give it an alias, you have to use it. So that's what I'm going to do here. And I'll start off by using this uppercase TK to create the node. I think it could have been a more imaginative name, but they didn't. And you can call the variable anything you want. It's just a handle to the object, the root node object. And then the key method you want to use off that object is something called the main loop. Now, what happens in a windowed object, like this Word document is a windowed object. As I move this around, as I use the menus, we can't see it, but every instance of me moving around is actually being repainted on my screen, my monitor. And the way it's done is there is a continual loop going through and looking for changes in my code, looking for changes that happen to an event. Like if I come over here and I say that I would like to highlight this. Yes, ignore, thank you. You're helping me way too much. Highlight this. That is a click event. It's a right-click event, and it accesses the context little dialog window. This is actually another window in here that I can use to pick a color. Now, all that is happening because of this loop, this invisible loop that's going running over and over again, so, a number of times per second, to track where my mouse cursor is in the event of me choosing, in this case, a color. I think I need to turn that spell check off for this session. Let me pause it and do. Okay, there we go. That shouldn't bother us. So that's what we're doing with this main loop. We're starting the loop up. It's invisible to you, but it's going to be painting the window over and over again on your screen and be able to respond to events such as clicking on a button or filling in something in a text box. Now, once you run that code, it'll pop up a little window. There's not much to it. There's a couple properties there, such as there's a little icon here. There's a little text that you can put here at the top. If you don't put anything in those properties, it'll assume the default, which is this little feather icon and the TK for your text. We'll see a little bit later on how you can change the text. But it's just a window. The window does have a few things, such as you can move it around. If I pop this up, make it run. Come here. So you can see the window starts up. It's running over here at a particular location. There's a default location. They measure it from the top and the sides here, or from the sides and the top, I guess, X and Y. You can change where this starts up at. You can also change, like I said, the text. But just this alone has some built-in features, such as the ability to move it, the ability to resize it, the ability to maximize it, minimize it, and of course, close it. So there's a lot of functionality built right into this application window, but of course it doesn't do a whole lot of good unless you start adding things like buttons, and we're not going to do anything fancy like menus and tabs, but certainly we need some buttons and items on there. That would be important to us. Now, to get those buttons on there, in most other languages I've worked with, they're often called controls. Here, they're called widgets. Same thing. A widget is just a control of some type, like a button, a text box, something that you want to paint onto the surface of your window. So the way it works is you go through and you make the window up first. I'm going to go ahead and specify the size by setting up the geometry. This is kind of a handy feature. It allows me to tell it a few things. First of all, the first part is what would the width like to be, what would the size like to be, height like to be, and then after that I will add a label. This is going to be a label object I'm going to put on the window. I have to pass in the window that I want to bind it to. So we've kind of seen this where you call a function. In this case, it's the constructor. I'm making a constructor, calling the constructor of a label object, and passing over a reference to another object. In this case, it's the window itself. Now, after I do that, I will have a reference to that label object. So this is going to represent my label object. And I will be able to, work with that. The thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Pack Layout Manager to paint it onto the window surface. If you forget to do the pack part, the object will be made, but it won't show up on the surface. Let's play with it for a minute. I'll show you what I mean. So if I come over here and I run this, it works. And you can see there's not a whole lot going on, but I got a label that says math results right here. Again, the size was defined by 400 by 100 units. It doesn't really matter what the units are, they're proportional, so it's a 4-to-1 ratio. And if I change that value, I'll get a different looking window. So I don't know, how about 4x4? Now you'll notice that it's starting in a particular location. Let me change that a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and, this is kind of a weird syntax. I'm going to make it 100 plus, 200. I don't know why they chose this, but they did. And what it does is it will, let's see, I'm not seeing much change there. It'll move it over to a different location when it starts up. There we go. See how it's moved it from way here to over there? I must have been close to the default. Oops, it's running. Let me stop it. One thing you'll find as you're playing around with this is that you forget to stop it. So you run it like this, and you click on it, and you forget that it's even running. I do that enough times that I run it, like multiple files or run multiple files, and multiple windows would be open. And I won't even notice that. If you come over here, you can see that there's an option to stop them all. So you probably want to check that on a regular basis, because otherwise they're just kind of running in the background, using up memory. So the deal is that you configure this code to define what your window is going to look like, and you bind objects or widgets to the window like this. And there's different properties and stuff that you can put in here. The IntelliSense little help doesn't always give you everything you need to know. Sometimes you just have to go look it up on the internet. And I don't like the way that they defined some of these properties. Like if I come over here and I click on the Control Q, you can see that somebody put some quality time into getting that docstring just right. But you can also see that instead of having the individual, in this case the constructor of the label object, have its own docstring, they just use a generic one. And give you some hints about a bunch of things, but it goes on so long that most people are just going to be like, too long, didn't read, and close it down. So what I find is that I often go out on the internet looking for answers. And if you look at the module, I have a lot of references. And at the very bottom here, I put some references to some links that I think you'll find useful if you're interested in this topic, to explore this topic further. Now, as you're going through and working with these widgets, I encourage you to think of the hierarchy that's being formed. I find it sometimes useful to just kind of document that hierarchy like this. I say, okay, I got a window root, and I guess let's see, I probably should call it the name of the object, like application window. And then the type of object it is. And then like I have a label there, that's the name of the label, and the type of object that is. And you can notice that I've gone ahead and indented this to kind of form the hierarchy. Sometimes they call this a tree, but it's an inverted tree because the root is at the top. So that's kind of a standard way of kind of organizing your thoughts about how this is going to lay out. And that is helpful to keep track of the different objects, widgets that are all over your form as you start getting more and more complex designs. So for right now, I'm going to use that little notation as I go through and talk about this, so that we can kind of keep track of what we're adding to our window. And you'll see me use it as we go forward. Now, in the last example, I used a layout manager called Pack. And as I had mentioned, if you don't include that, let me go ahead and run this without that. The label object was made, but it never appeared on the screen. You have to have a layout manager to get the object to appear on the window. Now there's actually a few of these. There's not that many, but there are a few of them. The one we're going to use is the grid. I think that one's actually very useful to use. And what it does is it sets up a little grid here. So if I were to add 3 labels on here, widget 1, 2, and 3, I could visually imagine it looking kind of like this. There would be a line here, and a line here, and one here, and one here. In other words, it's going to set up a grid of 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2, 3, a 3 by 3 grid, and each of the buttons and labels and text boxes that you put onto the form are going to be assigned to one of these boxes in that grid. Now, there's also the one that we just used, the pack, and that one's kind of interesting. It's free flowing. It basically packs the widgets side by side or top to bottom, depending on your specification. They're nice and tight. You can actually put some spacing in there, etc. That one's a little bit more free flowing. The advantage of that is sometimes when you enlarge the window, it may flow a little bit more friendly, like the grid will be more solid. It doesn't flow as well when you make changes to the size. But getting it to look nice in various different configurations or sizes of the windows can be kind of a pain. If you've ever done any web programming and you've used different relative positioning on, like with cascading style sheets, you'll know that although that is really good, especially if you believe that the websites are going to be viewed by lots of different browsers and lots of different devices like a cell phone or laptop or desktop, etc., that's an important thing, but it is a lot more work sometimes. So for our needs, we're just going to stick with the grid. But there is also another one where you actually just place them by indicating their position relative to the X and Y position, and just setting them in that position. It'll be they'll be parked there, and they can even overlap at that point. Now, none of these are bad. They're all just a little bit different, and you can mix and match, but you really should. So if you're going to choose one, you should, in that same hierarchy, you should try to stick with it, because it becomes kind of a mess if you do. And like I said, for this course, we're just using the simple grid. I think that's the easiest way to go, and that's one I recommend you start off with. Now for the grid, you're going to specify the row and column to make up that grid. So there's going to be rows, 1, 2, 3 rows. There's going to be 1, 2, 3 columns, like if I look at this grid here. And of course, as we build our application, we'll have to be mindful of that. You can also go ahead and indicate if you want to have the widget stick to a side of that cell, that little box. By default, it sticks right in the middle if possible, but you can have it stick to the east side of the cell, west side of the cell, north and south, and you can even go through and say southwest, southeast, combinations of that. What's happening when you use these designations, east, west, north, south, and any combination, is it combines those using a bit flag. And we've talked a little bit about bit flags, where the numbers kind of add up to, so there's a number for south, there's a number for west. You add those two numbers together and it knows that you want it southwest. But of course that would be kind of tedious to do, so they put this little alias on here for, this is a property, and when that property is red, it's a constant. When that's red, it all adds up to the bit flag. Let's just take a look at the code here. So I'm going to create the window, and this time I'm going to give it a title. I just added a title on there. And I'm going to create the label just like I did before. This time though, I'm using the grid instead of the pack layout manager. And when I use the grid, I want to specify which row and which column. I can specify, like here, northwest. I want it on the northwest side. I can specify things like padding. Padding allows me to move things around by little increments. Let me show you what I mean. So if I run this now, you can see that I've got a couple buttons on here. And the grid would look something like this. So we got one row, and another row, second row, and then there is one column and a second column. And you'll note that it's not starting off at 0, it's starting off at 1. So the math label is actually right here in row 1, column 1. That's it right there. And since I have it sticking to the northwest, it's kind of hard to tell. It would be up here in this upper left-hand corner. And the pad, that would be 10 little, I'm not sure that it's actually pixels. Let's just call it 10 little spaces. It's probably pixels, but I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to look it up. By 5. Now, it's kind of hard to tell here because I'm dealing with some pretty small values. But let me go ahead and put in 100, and we'll see what the difference is. You can see that now it's padded things out. It put in 100 extra spaces, and what that, or yeah, we call it spaces. What that means is that now everything's moved over here. So this value here has been added right there. And if we were to change this, I don't know, 50, we'll see that, heck, it's even off the map there. I got to crease it to see the size. Now, I got to tell you, getting these things to look nice is, I don't know if it's fun, but it certainly is a lot of trial and error. And I will say that it can take up a lot of time. I spent a lot of time, even though I know better, trying to make things look pretty. And to tell you the truth, I am not a user interface designer. My user interfaces are utilitarian at best. They will never be pretty, but they will work. They just won't be pretty. So I think that there's a certain skill set, a certain attribute that people have that allows them to make things look a little bit nicer. Yeah, that's not really my strong point. So you can play with this all you want, but I will caution you that it's fun to mess around with, and it will suck up a lot of time if you do it. So I strongly recommend you try to avoid messing with this too much as we go forward in this module. Okay, so now I can set my buttons on here. You saw those buttons already. Notice that they're in row 2. And because they're both in the same row, one's in column 1, one's in column 2, it lays it like this. You also notice that I added a padding of 10 and 5. And trying to get that to look right is a little bit tough. A lot of times you have to kind of mess around with this to make it look right. And sometimes it's not really obvious because the numbers kind of add together. So if I do this, you can see that that's 5. So this must be 5 and 5, which means that I need to go back to 10. A little more realistic. I may have to, choose 8 or something like that to get it look pretty. But again, don't mess with it too much. So I put in a label and 2 buttons. I used the grid option to lay them out. And that was it. That was how we were setting these up. The key takeaway here is to make sure you set up these column and rows. The padding is important if you want to look and feel, but the column and rows are the most important part here as you go through and you add this together. Now, what I recommend is that you pause the video and you try it out yourself. Go through and see if you can make this work. We're going to add some more buttons, so you can use the same code I have given you here and just add on more code. Right? That's kind of the game plan, so you don't have to spend a lot of time with it. We want 4 buttons. We want the add, subtract, multiply, and divide, kind of like we started off with all those long weeks ago. And as I keep mentioning over and over again, don't worry about minor differences in the way it looks. Try to get it close, but if it doesn't look exactly the same, move on. Don't worry about it. And I'll see you back when you get done. Now, as I said, you can start off with the original code that I gave you in that last listing, listing 3. Get that up and running, make sure it works, and then add on the other other 2 buttons, multiply and divide. The key thing here was to, when you copy and paste, make sure you change the text, make sure you change the column. Those are the things that most people forget. And also you need to change the name of the object. So you're getting a different button object and you need to have a different variable to capture it. If you caught those things, then everything probably worked just fine. If not, you need to go back and fix those. But hopefully you had some fun with that, and it's time to move on. A few years back, the industry started making the user interface a little bit different from what it had been previously. They started using this kind of flat look and feel to things. So we see that in a variety of applications. Older applications like this one here is, let's see, is this one raised? That's a little more flat too. But certainly we see things like, let's see if Notepad looks a little bit different. Let's see, new, save. Yeah, we can see that these are kind of flat. Certainly compared to, if I run this code here, you see how it's got the buttons are kind of elevated. They're not flat. So these are buttons in the newer style. These are buttons in the older style. They're raised, they're not flat. Anyway, industry as a whole started making some changes like that, and certainly it was noticed and additional classes were added to various different modules to get a nicer upgraded look and feel. In the TK interface, this newer stylized look and feel is represented by the TTK class that you can access. Now you can do that by just importing just that class alone, TTK, instead of the entire Tkinter. So from Tkinter, you just import the TTK, that's the updated look and feel module, or class, excuse me, and then use the TTK class to create these other objects, label objects, button objects, etc. Now, not everything was upgraded. You still have to use the standard TK interface to create the root node and some other things. So both of them have to be imported if you want to do this. But it does make your application look a little bit nicer and has become kind of the standard way people put these together. So I would update my code to use the newer style just because, well, it's more stylish. I'd also want to organize my code. So we've learned how to create classes. We can make a custom class to put our user interface code in there. If I were to go back in the last module, we created a console application to put the different modules together. Well, we could actually just go ahead, although you don't have to. We could actually go ahead and create a windowed interface to do the same thing. So instead of having a console menu, we could make buttons to load the text or the data from the file, or write the data from the file, or display the data in the list of employee objects, and so on. So organizing your code is always a good idea. In this case, we're not going to use modules, although we could. I'm just going to keep it simple by creating a UI class. So it would look something like this. I'd have a class that represents my main window. And I'm only going to have one main window, so I'll just make everything static. So when the when the main window loads up, I'll call the static method create main window, and it will configure everything, including my labels and buttons and the like. Now sometimes, if I'm going to have tabs, what I would do is I'd probably make multiple methods to configure each tab, just to organize things. Let's see if I'll show you one. Hang on. Okay, so here's an example. I've got another, this is from a different class, so it's not the lab we're going to do, it's from a lab from a different class. But you can see here that I've got a function to create the products tab, another one for the inventory tab, another one from the inventory accounts tab. And when I configure the tabs, I'll have a different function for each. And the reason why I do that is because as they become more and more depth, more and more controls on the screen, organizing your work becomes real important. It's really easy to lose track of where things are at if you have this big wall of code to deal with. So what I'd recommend is, as it gets more complex, you create these little functions that work with the individual containers. This is a tab container. So that when it ran, I'd be able to flip through these tabs, and each tab would have been loaded up with the various different controls to work with. So that's what I mean by being organized. And in this case, like, we're keeping it real simple for this level 1 course, just putting everything in one spot. But that's what I would normally do. So once I've got my little let's see, where are we at? Class, here we go, listing 5. Once I've got that class, then I would access the method in the class. It's the static method, so I'll go ahead and do that. But I still need a handle on that window object so I can add stuff to it or interact with it, such as start up the main loop. So that means that this method, whatever method I put together, needs to return a reference to that window object that I create. That's an important part. So make sure that whatever method you use to start up the root of the window application returns a reference to that root object, so that you can do things like this, which is to cause the main loop to run and then interact with it. Once you try to do that, go ahead and use the code that you started off with last time, but reorganize it. Reorganize it so that you have a UI class that is called main window. Again, you can reuse the code I have up here if you want, but you got to add on some more buttons. So also we're going to upgrade to the flat style TTK. It'll look again a little different on Mac than it does on Windows, but you'll still be able to see the difference. And we're going to have our 4 buttons plus that label, but now it's going to be inside of the class. So instead of putting this note in the header like I did previously, I'm moving it down to the class, because that's kind of that is where it would be described. I gotta say, I wish the tool that they use to identify or display the docstring was a little bit nicer. Trying to get this to look pretty is a real pain, so don't spend a lot of time on trying to make your docstring look pretty. Just make it so that the developer could look at it and see the organization. And also, don't spend a lot of time trying to make this look perfect either. It's a real tempting thing to do, but just take a few minutes to get that organized in a class, and then we'll come back and move on. Okay, hopefully you got that working. Let's see. It should end up looking kind of like this. And then you have the various different buttons that are in there, all 4 buttons. Key things that people make mistake on are, once again, making sure the columns line up and not returning that window object so you can reference it. That's the most common mistakes that people make. When it's all done, it should run, but it doesn't do anything yet, and that's our next stop. Let's talk about working with buttons. So whenever you click on a button, it's registered as an event. So it's a click event. There are, depending on which control you're hovering over, there may be different types of events. So like if I click on these buttons, there are click events for these, and these are already pre-programmed. The developers that made up the TK interface have already programmed these to work for me, such as minimizing, maximizing, and closing. But the custom controls that or widgets that I put on my screen, I have to do the work for it. And depending on the language and the modules that you download, these may have different events. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to keep it real simple. We're just going to do a click event. When I click on this with a left mouse button, I want that to perform some kind of action. And the way you do that is you hook up what's known as an event handler. Event handler is a function or method that fires when the event occurs. And the way you hook it up is, well, like this. So let me just give you a quick example. I'm going to make a class called Math Processor. And I'll put in there a couple of functions. One is a function that just does some simple addition without having any parameters at all. There's no parameters here. And it performs an action. It doesn't actually return any data. Now, this other function also performs an action, but it has parameters. And the way you work with these functions when you're setting up an event handler is different depending on if it has no parameters, without parameters, or with parameters. It's a little odd, but this is the way it works. So if it has no parameters, doesn't have any parameters at all, with parameters, or without parameters, excuse me, you specify the button object, you use square brackets to indicate the command property that you're going to connect the button to. Again, this syntax is kind of weird. We've been seeing how you can drill down into a property. That's not the way they designed it here. There's actually several different ways you can set these up, but we're just going to, in this course, look at one. So I put in the word command. That's the command property I'm referencing of the button object. And I connect the function / method to that command. Now, if I were to look at different controls, there would be different properties I'd want to attach it to. So you'd have to go out the internet and find out which properties are available to perform event handling. But for a button, it's just a command property. Another thing that people always mess up on is they'll try to put parentheses here, thinking that this is a function call. It's not actually a function call. We're not calling the function. What we're doing is we're making a reference to the function. So you don't use parentheses here because you're not calling it. You're just making a reference to it. It'll be called, the function will be called when somebody clicks on the button, and only then. So once we've made a mapping, a reference to the function, it just loads that memory and waits for somebody to click on the button. And only at that point does it actually make the function call based on this reference. And it's a common thing that your event handlers will not return data, they'll just perform an action. And if they get called, it is common that you can't directly just pass in parameters. There's some reasons for it, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that you can't just put in some parentheses and put in some values here thinking that it's going to work because you're not actually calling it. You're making a reference to it. If you have some parameters that you want to pass in, you use this syntax called a lambda syntax. A lambda syntax is a function that is without a name. It's an anonymous function. We haven't really learned this in this course. They're a popular thing, but a lot of people find it confusing. Certainly, if you continue on in programming, you're definitely going to have to learn how to deal with these. For right now, let's just focus on the fact that you put that word lambda, you put the colon, you put in the name of your class and the method, and you can pass in your arguments into the parameters that way. Now, this code doesn't fire. It doesn't call the method when it hits this line of code. All it does is create an anonymous method that acts as a delegate. It's a delegate to the add with parameters method. At the time it gets called, when somebody clicks on button 5 in this case, it will then go over to the lambda, which is stored in memory, and at that point it will call that method, passing in whatever arguments you have. I know that sounds complex, but the fact of the matter is the syntax is easy. Understanding why it does that is perhaps complex, but the syntax is easy. So what I'm going to recommend at this level is just understand the syntax. And as you have more experience and you start working with object-oriented programming a little bit more and seeing how objects get passed around, it will eventually start making a lot of sense to you. But you don't need to know how the mechanics of how it works. You just need to know what the syntax is any more than you don't need to know how to rebuild an engine in your car to be able to drive it. You just have to know, do this, and it will pass those arguments over. Now, I'm using two custom functions, methods to hook up to my event handler, but you can actually use the methods that are part of Python too, or in this case, TK interface, such as I can destroy the window that has been launched. So this is actually still in the main window class. So the word self is referring to the main window object that gets created. And you can go self.window, which is a property to the window object that references the window object, and destroy is the method that will destroy the object so that the window actually closes. Once again, it's a reference to that method, so we don't use parentheses. That's a common mistake. You can see it in action if I launch this up. This is listing 6. Let me show you. So when I run this, if I call with parameters or without parameters, it's just going to add 5 and 5. If I add with parameters, it's going to do whatever I pass in, which is 5 and 2. 5 and 2 go into here, and it does that. And if I call that quit button, click on the quit button, it closes it. Now I'll go ahead and put a breakpoint on here. We'll see what happens. Let me put a breakpoint on these. I want to debug it. I want to be able to debug that. You can see that it does indeed enter into it. And I can just step into my code. Parameters, step into the code. You can see that the parameters have been passed over, or arguments have been passed over into the parameters, and it's performing the action. So using that, you can get it to perform actions when you click on the buttons. And of course, that's pretty important because otherwise buttons don't do you a lot of good. Now we've already got a user interface that looks like this. What we want to do is we want to connect those buttons to event handlers. And those these methods here in this math processor class are going to handle that event. Notice that in all of these, add, subtract, multiply, and divide, they're all going to be passing arguments into these parameters, and as such you have to use that lambda syntax. Right now, we'll just hard code it with some values, 10 and 3, and verify that it works. Once you got that working, we'll learn how we can actually customize it so we can pass values in here. But for right now, why don't you go ahead and pause the video and see if you can connect those. You'll have to make this class first in your code. So we start off with lab10.2 save as. Save it as 3, and then change the code so that we add in that math processing class and connect those buttons so they will call those methods when you click on the button. Go ahead and pause the video now. Give it a shot. Okay, let's see how you did. It should work like this, where whenever you click these buttons, you should see the results come up. And that proves that it works. Hopefully you didn't have much problem with that. The key things to remember is this syntax has to be just right. Things that I always make a mistake on when I copy and paste, I forget to change the names of things. That's unfortunate. You know, one thing that's kind of nice is that if you copy and paste something like this, I probably showed you this before, but if not, let me do it now. I click here, I highlight Alt Shift, and then I left click and drag, and I can put in some text. That helps me a lot. It's not magic, but it certainly does save me some time and stops me from making mistakes. The other thing that I do, and you may have done too, is when I copy and paste it, I forgot to change these. So if you do forget that, then what you end up doing, of course, is just adding and adding and adding, and that's why the numbers, values look wrong. Other than that, I think that is all I can think of. Hopefully you got that working. Now next, we want to see how we can capture entry data from the user. So we've been using input all this course. We want to be able to get access, we want to get data from a text box. So we use the entry widget for that. It's a text box, but they call it entry. This entry widget actually is a text box that gives you back only a single line of text. There's another one that has multiple lines of text, another type of text box. We'll see that a little bit later. But this one here is the entry one. So it looks like this. I will go through and I will add on. Let's see, I need to add on an entry. Oops. And this will be, line that up. I want 2 text boxes for the entry. Now, actually, you know what I think I want also? I want a label for it too. So I want this label, first number, and another one for second number. So let me put those in there too. Just my little documentation, not that it really makes a difference. I just think it's kind of an important feature. And let me do that, do that. Okay, that looks like a match. We're ready to go. So the way it works is I create a label first and put that in front of my entry. Now the reason why I want to do this is because I want a match pair so that the user interface looks like this. First number, entry box, second number, entry box. So I want to put those together first in label and entry text box pairs. That's what I'm doing up here. So make the label first. The reason why I stacked it is because it gets so long that it rolls off the page here. It looks ugly. But of course you don't have to. We have to pass it the application window like before, and I'm just specifying the width so that it has a fixed width. That's optional, but it looks nice. And I'm also going to make it so that it's bound to the east side. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to have to doctor those up, aren't I? I'll put that in later. Okay, so when I run this, I want those labels. Nope. Let me go back one. Oh, well, we'll eventually get there. When I run this, I want those labels to be bound to the east side so they line up vertically here. If I bind them to the west, they'll be, over here and vertical there. If I bind them to the east, they'll line up here, and I want to bind the text boxes to the west. That'll give me a nice clean look. Or clean it off anyway. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go ahead and mark this as east, and then the text boxes, when I put them in, actually I didn't even bother doing that. It's going to be just fun. This one adds to the grid. I just left it where it was. I'm also going to insert some starter values. So this is the value, and this is the format. So just inserting some data into there when it runs. That's just some default data so that they kind of know what to expect. If they don't, of course, change it, it'll just use the default value. So I do that with both these buttons and labels, and that creates an interface like this. And note that in that interface, I didn't specify, when I made the entry here, I didn't specify anything but the width. A width of 10. And as such, you can see it down here as 10. This is all right because it lines up nice and neat here. My buttons are 10 wide also. But if I want to change that, to make this longer for whatever reason, I may have to mess around with it. You also notice that because of the way this text became longer than the button, it's not really lining up pretty. I'll show you what I mean. So imagine one of the grid lines is here. These labels are on the east side, so they're all both these labels are going that way. They're sticking to that east side. But that button is sticking to the west side, less some padding that's built into the window. And as such, they just don't line up. Now, one thing I could do is I could actually just go ahead and make the button east to bring it over. That would look nice. That is something that might actually look pretty good. Or I can use another technique which will cause things to kind of span. So let me play around with this for a minute. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I do want to mess with it just a little bit. So that add button, we're going to change it so that it's to the, let's see. Well, it's actually already going to the east. I'm not sure why it didn't move over. There's something on that grid that's causing it to stick. Oh, I see. I already fixed that. In the original code, this is listing 7 is a more advanced version of that than this original version. What I did is I modified listing 7 to include these features. First of all, I want to make these text boxes a little bit bigger. I can do that by telling it to span across multiple grid lines. In this case, I said I want to span across 3 grid lines. So 1, 2, 3. It'll go all the way to the end if I give it the proper size. So if I go through and say, okay, that second number grid needs to allow me to span it for that second number text box. Just add that on. Then later on, it'll span all the way across. 1, 2, 3. And as you can see, I changed it from northwest to northeast, and that's what moved it over. I'm not going to win any awards with this design, but it certainly made it look a little bit nicer. And that's, you know, that's kind of what you're shooting for at the beginning. Now, when you fill up these text boxes, they'll have the data, but you need to be able to get to the data and use the get method to do that. So the get method is how you access it. And the code right now, this looks nice, but it's not doing anything. Every time I click the button, it still does the same thing as it did before because I'm not capturing the data from those text boxes. That's the next stop. That's 8. What I do for that is I come here and I capture the data using this syntax. So I want to capture the first number. I use the get method to do that. And the second number, they're coming in as a string, just like they would if they were using the input command. So I need to convert them over to a float. And then once that's done, I do that for each of the buttons. Once that's done, now I'll be able to get the data from those text boxes and be able to run it. So if I put in, I don't know, 7 and 2, 9, 5, 14, and 3.5. Do be aware, of course, that I need to put error handling in here. Otherwise, you know, it's going to give me this ugly error message. But it doesn't actually close down due to the nature of the way the window just keeps looping. It doesn't actually completely crash it. But if you want to have a friendlier error message, you're going to have to put a try-catch block in there and make sure you handle that. So that's how you set it up. It's not difficult to do. And I just go ahead and replace each of these hard-coded values with this syntax. Otherwise, it would still get, you just use the default values here. So what I'd like you to do is hook it up. Go ahead and pause the video, see if you can get Lab 10.4 to work, which is basically the same code as above, but you're going to have to replace these hard-coded values with this. Give it a shot. See you back in a minute or two. Next thing on the list is I want to have it display the data in something other than the console window. If I were to run this from a command window, yeah, actually let me just go out to the command prompt here. Yeah. Boy, I'm not being very for the love of Pete. There we go. Python and listing 08.py. Okay. You see it pops up, but whenever I press the button, it's printing out in the console window, which is great and all, but that's certainly not what I would expect from a windowed application. Instead, what I want to do is I want to have some kind of place to display the data. Now, in most languages, most environments, you can actually put things in a label, but a better choice is to use a multi-line text box. The reason why I say it's a better choice is because with them, you can copy and paste things. So, like this is a Windows this is a windowed application on Microsoft Windows. It gives me information about the system, and if it's a label, I can't copy and paste off a label. So you can't right-click on something and copy and paste off a label. Other things, like these are labels. Other things, they will allow you to copy and paste, and that's a lot handier. So let's see if I can find one. Give me a second. Let's think about it. Okay, so these are labels. I know they're labels because I can't copy and paste off them. So, let's see, here we go. This is the text box. And see how I can highlight that? And I can copy that. Yeah. And paste it. So if I want that capability, then using a text box, a multi-line text box, is much handier than a label. And for our case, that's what we're gonna do. I think you'll find it a useful technique. So to make this work, I'm going to add in this new feature right here. It's a text. I don't know why they didn't call it multi-text or whatever. They didn't. They call it text. So I'm going to call it multi-text myself. That's my prefix on there. It makes more sense to me. And then it's just specifying the width and the height and where it's going to be located. I'm going to span it across all the 4 columns. And when I get done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over a reference to that text box so I can write to it. Now, here's the thing. Since I can't return data from my event handlers, I have to get tricky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a different method. In other words, this write sum to text box is a method that writes to the text box, as long as you pass it which text box you're talking about. I will pass over a first number and second number, and from that method, which performs an action but doesn't return data, I will call the math methods. Now this is not math processing, this is the math IO class. So in order for that to work, I did this. I made a new class called math IO. And I had a couple of features. One thing is I want to clear out the text box anytime I want. If I want to do that, I need to set the text box state to normal so I can add stuff or remove stuff or change stuff in it. If its state is disabled, it's locked. You can't change it. You can't change the data, which means you can't add or remove stuff. You can copy and paste out of it, but it's blocked. You can't make any changes. And if I want to get rid of the text in there, I can start at the first character and go all the way to the end of all the data. And that will delete all that data from that text box. So that's one of the methods I like to put in there. Another method I'm putting in there is just write sum to text box, which I pass over the text box, and I call that math processor that we made previously. And notice that in this case, instead of printing it, it returns data. That's important. I didn't do that on all of these. Using print will always print the console command. I don't want to do that. So I need to return the data, but I can't return the data. I can't have return values in error handlers. So what I do is I return it from the processing layer to the user interface layer, and I use that data to write to my text box. I do that by inserting it into the text box. I start out whatever the current text is at the end. That way it keeps appending values instead of overriding values. It goes to the end of whatever text is in there currently and adds on new text. I also put a carriage return in there so that it looks nice. I'm using a little format function to interject the first number, the second number, and the result into my little string. I write that string in there, and then I disable it so that it's now nobody can just type stuff into it. It actually just displays the data. So I turn on the normal state so I can add stuff and disable it so people can't mess with it. When it's all done, wrong one. It's all done. It looks like this. So currently, see I can put stuff in there? That's not disabled. I probably should start up with a disabled state. Clear the results. Ah, I can't do it anymore. That's because in that clear method, I disabled it before I left the method. And so it's in disabled status right now and I can't mess with it. I put these values in. The sum of 5 and 2 is 7. Notice that I can still copy and paste out of there. Copy. Paste. I get my results. And of course I can just keep adding results. Oops. Oh, I haven't hooked these up yet. That's what you're going to do in the lab. But once I get that done, I'll be able to add more results and copy those out. Now, one thing to think about is that we could put this in a comma separate value list. And the advantage of doing that is I could copy that data from here and put it in a spreadsheet. Of course, we could always make a button that when you clicked on it, it just took the data from the text box, read the data from the text box, or if you made a list object, you could make it so that it would just dump the data from the list object with your results into a text file like we've been doing. But we don't need to do anything like that, fancy stuff like that right now. We just need to get data writing to that text box. So you'll have to make a method in the user interface, the input-output section class, to interact with that text box, and then just call the appropriate method to get the sum, difference, product, and quotient, like we've always been doing many different times. Let's just see if you can get that to work. Remember that in listing 9, it's working, but only the add button's working. Subtract, multiply, divide, and clear results are not connected yet. Oh, it does give you the code for that Math.io class, but the code's not hooked up to the event handlers. That's your job in Lab 5. Go ahead and pause it, see if you can get this thing to work, and I'll see you back here in a few minutes. Well, I hope you got that working. Again, the key things that I see that go wrong are not changing things when you copy and paste. So if you're anything like me, I'd go down to the user interface class here for the window, and I would have done some copying and pasting from the add button, the sum button, to the difference button, and sometimes I forget to make a change. So the only real change you have to do is make sure that you're calling the correct method. Everything else stays the same. So it's not difficult, but that's usually where things go awry. And since I gave you most of the other code there, that shouldn't have been too bad. The other thing I did was I added another button here, and all I did was just copy and paste from the previous button, added it to row 6, made it span so it was just a little bit bigger. Put a different text on there, and called that clear text box, making sure I pass over which text box I'm talking about so it can actually clear it. If I had multiple text boxes on there, this same method would work with multiple ones. And because I'm passing an argument into it, I could use it on different applications too. You want to try to write your code as you get more and more practiced, more experienced, in such a way that it's easier to reuse in other projects. So kind of a short, I don't know if it's that much shorter, it's about I guess about the same as always, but it feels shorter because we're not covering as many different topics. The topic here was just how to make the user interface. I do want you to check out some stuff with C#. I provided some example code and some videos, so there's still some more to watch, another hour or so, I think, maybe not quite that much, about how you might use a different IDE, Visual Studio, to do Python programming, and how you might use that Visual Studio environment to do C# programming. And what I'm trying to show you there is how similar they are, and how different they are, and what you've learned will be directly transferable to different integrated development environments and different languages, which is kind of my hope. That's what I was hoping for you to get to, so you had a good foundation. In this module, though, the questions I'd like you to think about are, what are the differences between a console and Windows UI? Just pause and think about that. And what are the pros and cons of using a Windows UI? It's to get to look nice. That's definitely takes time, so that may be a con. And what is event handling? Event handling is an important concept that we use in windowed and web applications. And widgets. What are widgets? What is a widget? Can you give me an example? If you were in an interview or you're talking to a coworker, would you be able to explain these things? And when you feel like you can, it's time to go out and take a look at that assignment. And lastly, thanks for watching.